Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you might be. I'm Father Michael Place, a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago. I had the privilege of serving Cardinal Bernardine as his theologian for 14 years, and I currently am chair of the Catholic Common Ground Initiative. The initiative was launched by Cardinal Bernardine and Monsignor Philip Murnian in 1996, and the purpose was to enhance foster dialogue within the church in order that we could find and strengthen a common ground based in the power and movement of the Holy Spirit within the life of the church. Over the years, the dialogue has addressed various issues of pastoral significance for the life of the church. But this is the first time we've attempted to advance that dialogue through sponsoring a webinar. So we welcome all of you who are joining us and look forward to, towards the end of the session today, we anticipate going about an hour. The last 15 minutes we'll be able to take questions from you and engage in conversation about that. So I'd ask you to type your questions in the chat box and we will take a look at them at the end of our formal conversation. With us today, we have Dr. Nichole Flores, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, and Dr. Richard Gaillardet, who's the Joseph Professor of Catholic Systematic Theology and Chair of the Department of Theology at Boston College, and Dr. Carmen Nanko-Fernandez, who is Professor of Hispanic Theology and Ministry and Director of the Hispanic Theology and Ministry Program Catholic Theological Union here in Chicago. And I am located in the Bernardine Center at Catholic Theological Union, which is the home for the Catholic Common Ground Initiative. Our topic today is the challenge which the church is facing from sexual misconduct, certainly something that has been in the headlines, and even more so because this week Pope Francis has called together in the Vatican the presidents of conferences of bishops from across the world to address the question of sexual abuse, sexual misconduct within the life of the church. As we know, the Pope has attempted to, in a sense, downplay expectations. But I found it interesting that Cardinal Cupich, in an interview this past week, was clear that at least from his perspective, the hope that the gathering would not just be about the catechesis, which the Holy Father spoke to, but that it actually would move to some clear set of framework that the bishops could take back from the meeting to their individual conferences. So, because the topic is one that elicits a great deal of energy within the life of the church, our discussion today is about what we can expect from the gathering of the presidents of bishops' conferences. And we're going to begin with sort of stepping back and saying, what do we think the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, this call to dialogue and discernment within the life of the church, can bring to an understanding of what the bishops are going to be addressing in Rome later this week. And we'll start with Dr. Richard in Boston.
Well, it seems to me that at the heart of the Common Ground Initiative is an ecclesial methodology. It's a methodology that's entirely in keeping with Pope Francis's commitment to synodality, to encouraging a church that learns to walk together in the midst of our differences. So the fact that the Pope has called a meeting of all the presidents of Episcopal conferences, it certainly reflects both his own commitment to synodality and a preference for precisely the kind of deep commitment to walking together that was at the heart of Cardinal Bernardine, his own ministry, and his reasons for founding this initiative.
Thank you. Carmen.
Thanks, Michael. I guess I see it as an opportunity and a space. It provides a space to have the kinds of conversations that are necessary that have to be beyond just the realm of having conversations of bishops with bishops. And because this is a situation that impacts the entire church, not just the hierarchy, and there needs to be more input and conversation, theological as well as conversations from other disciplines within academia, within the human sciences and the social sciences that are necessary. And I think something like Common Ground provides that space to have necessary encounters and dialogues about a matter that's impacting all of us.
Thank you, Nichole.
Yes, thank you for having me. In addition to those things, which I agree with both of those accounts, I see Catholic Common Ground Initiative as providing a space to take stock of both the theological and intellectual aspects of the crisis, but also the human aspects. I think I've had a hard time approaching this topic as a scholar. I find myself over and over again returning to my identity as a mother, as a daughter, as a member of a parish, and approaching it that way. And I think that the principles and the ways that we practice dialogue are important for being able to hold those things in tension and not just making it about either the doctrinal or practical institutional issues involved, but also the emotional stakes in the way that this really strikes at the heart of us as a people of faith.
Thank you. So with that is sort of a framework that we're gathered as participants in the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, and which gives us an opportunity to create the space for the type of conversation that Pope Francis has been talking about. I'm going to ask you, beginning, we'll stay with Nichole. How would you describe the current moment? What is it, a crisis? If you put it in the big picture of the history of the church, what is this moment that we're looking to have a conversation about?
Yes, thank you. It's been hard for me to identify a particular analog to think about this historically, but I do think we are in crisis, and a part of it might be not so much a new crisis as a continuation of a crisis of confidence in the church from the perspective of the laity that has been festering since at least the mid-1960s. And the way that the church as a moral authority is really being continually brought under scrutiny by both the laity for reasons we can discuss more in depth, but also as a public moral authority. And I think it's a crisis in that it threatens the kind of work that our church, not just meaning the institutional hierarchy, but that the Catholic faithful can do for the common good. That it's becoming harder and harder for the faithful to walk out into public spaces and say, I'm Catholic, and to use that as the basis for the good that we do for society. So I think there's a lot that is that feels like it's in crisis, but I think that's a particularly important one in light of a faith that calls us to be public people.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, you know, I'm mindful of the former Master General of the Dominican Order, Timothy Ratcliffe, who's fond of saying crisis is the Catholic Church's spécialité de la maison, the specialty of the house. You know, the church was born in crisis, and it seems to move from Kareem, really from crisis to crisis. And so from that point of view, one could say you can look throughout history and you can find similar crises, but not the same kind of crisis. I mean, I suppose in terms of enormity, you'd want to go back to the Protestant Reformation. But there are three things that make this crisis, it seems to me, quite different from previous ones the church has addressed. The first is the global reach of the scandal. I mean, this, and this is reflected in the Pope's decision, of course, to call presidents of Episcopal conferences throughout the church. This is now a scandal of entirely global dimensions. And it's hard to find a previous one. Even the Reformation was centered much more sort of in Europe, North America, than it affected the church in other parts of the world, right? So that's the first. The second is, this may be the first major crisis in which it's being responded to by a laity who are no longer willing to simply cede responsibility of the church to hierarchy. And this speaks to what Nichole said. And third, it's a crisis that's taking place in a time when large numbers of Catholics are no longer willing to fall prey to what I would call the fallacy of the given. The assumption that this structure of our church was dropped down from on high, Christ instituted it in all of its particulars, and therefore it's immune to reform. I think Catholics today are much more aware that obviously there's some essential features in the life of the church, but there is much that at one point seemed exempt from ecclesial reform, the Catholics today recognize now needs to be put on the table for potential reform.
Carmen.
I tell you, I struggle, Michael, because I think the terms crisis and scandal don't capture the magnitude of this. And in part is that we've become too accepting of a timeline that wants to situate everything with a seminal moment in 2002. And in the United States, in the early 1960s, the founder of the Paracletes brought to the bishop's attention that the issue of pedophilia was not one that was going to be easily resolved, and was probably one that could not put those who suffered from this affliction back into ministry situations. In 1974 in Milwaukee, it was deaf young people who outed the situation to the bishop in Milwaukee, and by leafleting cars. And so it wasn't breaking news in 1974. 1985, 86, you have Jason Berry and the NCR documenting everything, the development of the Bishop Accountability Page. The 1990s, you even had the CTSA inviting Barbara Blaine and others to having a session at a theological academy meeting. And then, and it's still nothing moves really until then 2002. And then I almost wonder if how it was dealt with in 2002 was necessarily the best, because we keep looking to it and saying, well, this is good and it worked. We just have to tweak this and move forward. And I'm saying, it's like, no, because part of me, and again, I spent years teaching high school, and when I see all these, all of a sudden the dioceses are all producing their documents with their lists in the week before or the 2 weeks before this meeting, it felt like kids turning in their homework at the last minute. And this isn't breaking. Even if you look at 2002, that's what we're in 2019, that's 17 years ago. So at some level, I don't know if 2002 didn't stress the urgency of this, and neither did the 1990s or 1985 or 1974 or 1960. I guess I have a concern that this is like a crisis scandal on steroids that has deeper roots and deeper roots that aren't going to be resolved if all we're looking at are practical or pastoral solutions, but that maybe this is a moment that's calling us to a deep conversation and reflection and possibly transformation of the theologies and ecclesiologies that are also part, and this is the symptom of them. And so I think this is significantly bigger. And part of me just wants the Pope at some level to get the practical piece taken care of by making a canonical solution to a procedure which he would have the ability to take care of. And then say, okay, here's the canonical formula. Now let's move and deal with the rest of this, which is significantly deeper than 2002.
From my own perspective, I would agree. I think if you look at the Pope's letter to the bishops of the United States, which was an amazing document in many ways, he was calling to go to a much deeper level of conversation. And it almost had belied within it suspicion about practical solutions, that they become ends rather than means. I also can have very clear memories of the 90s, and certainly the church in Chicago was slow and late in its own way. But when Cardinal Bernardine decided to bring together the what was called the Gorman Commission, headed by Bishop Gorman, to bring together experts in the fields together, he shared the results of that with the conference. And there was a very clear decision that there would not be a national response. And the same group of bishops that opposed the consistent ethic and opposed common ground opposed those initiatives for much the same reasons. And so going to Richard's comments, there is profound ecclesiological themes that are at play. Mm-hmm. And those in part captured, became the victor in the 90s of a perspective on ecclesiological themes and suppressed the discussion. So Richard, you have your comment.
Yeah, well, just doubling down on the question of ecclesiology, and I'm thinking very much of, I thought Carmen's comments were quite helpful. Particularly you're saying, look, I hope they create a canonical mechanism as much so that we can move on. And the reason I like what she's saying is, I'm a little concerned that too much energy is being dedicated to mechanisms for policing and investigation and reporting. Now, I want to be clear that I think those kinds of things have to happen, but I'm not sure they get to the heart of the problem. And so when the Pope puts his finger on a clerical culture, or when Bishop Vincent Long from Australia gives a really quite incisive analysis of the hegemony of a clerical culture as the heart of the problem, I'm actually more interested and would love it if at this meeting of the presidents of the Episcopal conferences, that question got a lot more attention. And that's not just a policing thing, see, because that goes to a deeply embedded culture that's institutionalized in our church, and that we're going to have to look at in far more comprehensive and systemic ways than simply creating oversight commissions, for example. And so I do hope that we balance out questions about policing and reporting with a much more probing analysis of the clerical roots at the heart of this culture.
That takes us then sort of logically into another question. But before we go there, I want to remind those who've signed on that you can type your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them in a little bit. So we've identified, I think, the fact that this is a profoundly important moment in the life of the church, and that there are deeper themes that need to be addressed than just the structural response, as important as those are. What do we see as the obstacles when the bishops gather? What are the obstacles to their getting to those deeper themes? Anyone want to comment on that? Carmen?
Yeah, I want to put it in terms of a metaphor from higher education. And in higher education, when an institution like a seminary goes through its accreditation process, the first thing it does is a self-study where the institution itself looks at what's going on and examines itself in terms of its mission. The second thing that happens is a visitation from outsiders who are not of your institution, but who have an idea and or are in the same industry. And then the third is the accreditation. You get it with some sort of conditions. And when I'm looking at what's happening this week, and when I've looked at what's happened just in the United States, what I see is the self-study, the assessment, and the accreditation all being done by the exact same body of people. So in other words, is that they're looking at what they've done, and the hierarchy has pulled itself together, and that's commendable that they should do the self-study. But the next pieces are not happening. And the next pieces involve that others outside of the hierarchy are involved in a process of assessing what, in terms of your mission, And how how is your understanding of what the situation is true to the situation or not? What are the best practices in the field? And then how does one move forward, and what gets challenged? So until this process is beyond just the internal reflection of the hierarchy, and what you were just saying before about, just being, checking off checklists and counts and seeing that we're, okay, we follow this procedure, we follow that one. I don't see it moving beyond that. And that's why I think one of the advantages of something like Common Ground is that you try to bring in different perspective and voices, including those that might not agree. And right now, this just feels like a very internal process that is not going to require the church much beyond coming up with a new checklist, and then thinking that the situation has been handled, while possibly being mindful that there may be some cultural differences because it's a global situation. And quite honestly, that kind of concerns me, because I don't think then we'll move to what was being alluded to before, that this is an ecclesiological situation, it's a theological problem. And I don't know that people really want to, I don't know that our bishops and parts of our church really want to go, because that can be even more painful to start looking at what is embedded in this symptomatic response.
Nichole.
Yes, I think that as the bishops begin to gather, or the heads of the conferences begin to gather, there's always a risk to, not a risk, but a reality to consider that there's a lot of differences among the theological, ecclesial, political views of those men. But my concern and the obstacle I've identified is not necessarily of difference or polarization, but possibly of what I've been calling a negative solidarity. A solidarity in which the interests of the institution become that which is being defended over against the broader good of the church and of the larger society. I think that negative solidarity is in part what has allowed for this culture. I think the language of the clerical culture, the hegemony of the clerical, is very accurate, it's apt. That's what's allowed this problem to fester in the first place, and it's what has prevented a full confession and repentance on part of both the individuals, but also the larger culture at stake that is participating and acknowledging what's at stake for the larger church. So I think that I'm always wary of the way that the divisions among the bishops are going to play out when they gather. But I think in this case, I'm perhaps more concerned about the way that they might kind of circle the wagons again and codify the response in procedure rather than in mechanisms or ideas that are going in practices that will really change cultures that need to be changed.
Richard.
Well, I think, there are a number of obstacles that we're facing. And Nichole nicely put her finger on this in terms of the different ecclesial and political contexts. I would add cultural context. Cardinal Luis Tagle, has pointed out that one of the real problems in the Philippines is that the influence of what he called a kind of culture of shame, which makes it very difficult for victims to speak up. African theologians that I've talked to have spoken of the difficulty in Africa in which priests are treated as almost sacral figures, making it again doubly difficult for people to speak out against the clergy. So, one of the difficulties is, as Carmen pointed out, in the English-speaking world, this has been brought to our consciousness a long time ago. We've been grappling for it for a while. The difficulty is there are other parts of the world where there's been massive ecclesiastical denial. And even ecclesial denial. Lots of folks in the local church that aren't even thinking this is a problem for them. So this is both an obstacle to this looking like a success, but it's also the principal reason why I think the Pope called this meeting in the first place. Most Americans, I suspect, are going to walk away from this thing disappointed, precisely because we're at a very different point. We're impatient with, as Carmen pointed out, the somewhat minimal baseline kind of reforms that the Dallas Charter called for. But on the other hand, this meeting could be very important for other parts of the world who are resistant at even recognizing that there's a problem. You know, the other thing I wanted to respond to, again, Carmen's use of the accreditation process is interesting. We do have one kind of limited example of this, and that's what's happened in Australia, where Australia went through a limited sort of self-study. I would argue they didn't go through it as fully as they should, but the external review came in the form of the Royal Commission report. And the same thing happened in Ireland with the Murphy Commission report. In the US, we're seeing it in a little bit more problematic way with things like the Pennsylvania grand jury report, which I have some more problems with, in line with some of what Peter Steinfels mentioned. But now, if you look at Australia, what's happened? They've had those external people. There is no accreditation process, but I'm actually modestly emboldened by their decision to hold a plenary council to address this in 2020. In fact, I would love it if the Pope would say to each of the presidents of Episcopal conferences, you should take a look at what Australia is doing in creating a plenary council where, by the way, unlike synods, lay people can participate, lay people can vote. You can do a multi-year process of listening at the local level. One of my hopes would be that this meeting empowers the bishops' conferences to go back to their regional churches and say, we need to start a serious synodal process that invites the people on the ground to feel that they're able to speak out about this in a more structurally appropriate way.
I'm wondering, do folks think that the internal tensions over the broader agenda, if you will, of Pope Francis could get in the way of this discussion being successful in Rome?
I don't want to dominate, but so
Richard,
I'll defer to Carmen
and
and
go first.
Go ahead. I'm sorry?
Go first.
Oh,
Richard.
okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge issue. We're seeing it in the sense that, without being overly simplistic, there are two competing narratives of what's going on here, right? I mean, one narrative, the one that I led with, the one that I think is more compelling, is the existence of this hegemonic clerical culture that's tentacles reach out in all sorts of directions and deals with gender issues and a whole lot of other issues as well. And then there's the counter narrative that we saw offered by Archbishop Vigano, you know, which wants to, frankly, do a whole lot of scapegoating around gay priests. And so we see this sort of, these two narratives also aligning quite closely with those who are very supportive of what Pope Francis is doing and those who I think are eager to use this as a way to bring Pope Francis down in some ways. I also think some of Pope Francis's own pastoral tendencies are hurting him in this regard, in the sense that, unlike his previous two, the last two predecessors, he is much more of an advocate of the principle of subsidiarity, which is to say, I think he's a bit allergic to heavy-handed global responses and would rather see these things dealt with at the local level, to which I would only respond that there's a second principle in the principle of subsidiarity. You start with the preferential option for things being addressed at the local level, but sometimes you have to recognize if the local level is not able to address the issue, higher authority needs to be intervened. But I think Pope Francis is very reluctant to sort of impose, Carmen, what you were suggesting, you know, a universal mechanism. I'm not sure I agree with him on this, but I think it goes against his pastoral instincts.
Mm-hmm.
Nichole?
My concern is somewhat different. And again, this might be coming from my perspective as a layperson, as a mother. I think that the tensions between, you know, these opposing sides and the polarization and the narrative and the continual focus on it is so out of touch with the pain of people in the pews right now. Not that that Rick was writing that. I think Rick helps to clarify that a lot. But I think that's the tensions. They're always there, and I think that the Vigano situation really illustrated just how it's a tinderbox. The smallest thing, or a larger thing, can really kind of ignites a controversy that can prevent the conversations from happening that need to happen to respond to those who are hurting. And of course it is those who have been victimized. But I think about this now. This isn't the situation, but I try to do an imaginative activity of what I would do if I found that my pastor from the church where I grew up was on a list, and how I would respond. And it had nothing to do with these questions that kind of get so much attention. But even asking that question, I think called into question, and I think this is not just me, this is a lot of Catholics. It calls into question, what is the institution's relationship to me and to my family, and are they really on my side? Are they really concerned about the issues that are going to make it possible for me to trust my parish and diocese and a larger church with my child? And that I hope that maybe even through Francis's pastoral presence, that there's some way to get at that. Even though I'm confident that this infighting will be prevalent.
Carmen, any thoughts?
Yes, I actually think that that the pastoral response is the canonical response, and Francis has already used it when he addressed the issue of the nullity of marriage. So that would not be unprecedented by this Pope. So that the canon law, which does fall within his pastoral responsibility as the pontiff, would be something that he would be able to do, and therefore still remain faithful to his sort of gut instincts of being a good pastor. At the same time, there's a part of me, it's probably my New York cynicism, that also thinks it doesn't matter what Francis would ever say about anything, because to many people, he's Francisco. And I like to say, as a Latino, I like to look at it and say, what happened to the Pope? He comes from Latin America, and he may be an Italian immigrant or the child of Italian immigrants, but to the majority of the world that looks up them, he's just another Latino. And that means that he's not so bright, he's pastoral, he's really good, but he's not academic. He's not a theologian. And looking at it from when I see Francis or Francisco, I see somebody who's operating from a presence that the world is messy, and teología y pastoral is en de conjunto. And there's no way that you can have a pastoral response to this, but also simultaneously having a theological response. And that they're intertwined, and good luck pulling those strands apart, because it doesn't work. They're not in separate conversations that then get manipulated by whoever the conversation master is. So I think that in some ways he's coming from that worldview, Latin American as well as U.S. Latino, that says that these issues are complicated, embedded examples that need responses that are both teología y pastoral and en de conjunto. The second piece of that would be that they need to be responded to at the local and particular level. So sort of building on what Richard talked before about subsidiarity, but at the same time, because it's a global church, we're talking about the intersection of particularities. And that this is not just the problem of the church in the United States, it's the problem of the church in Mexico, in Poland, in Nigeria. So at that sense, that I think that's what he's seeking to, how do we get these different particularities to both explore their own situations, like the example that Richard gave with Australia, because there is no certain kind of pastoral set of responses that can apply all the way across the board. But at the same time, there are some questions we really need to consider. And the third one is that he's also very culturally attentive. And one of the issues that certainly have been raised by the part of the world that's been colonized is that, and Catholicism hasn't dealt with this effectively, is that Christianity and Catholic Christianity came with colonization in many parts of the world. And part of the colonization involved basically imposing new ways of being family onto different cultures. So sometimes what we're dealing with is not really how a culture had its own mechanisms socially and anthropologically of how it addressed family situations. Richard raised the example of shame cultures. And I think that sometimes Christianity imposed a very particular cultural view along with its practices or rituals, etc. And that's not being taken into account either. So how do we deal with that piece of the legacy? That what also came is a particular set of ways of understanding family. And that in part, did our system kill the very structure that then allowed this sort of bad seed to kind of grow in places it should never have grown? So those are kinds of the things I see that maybe the papacy of Francis can raise. But I honestly just don't think Francis is ever going to get a break when it comes to, having forces set against him.
Thank you. Thank you. Reminder to those who are joining us, if you have questions, to type them in and we'll look at them in a little while. As the cleric on the conversation, how we undo this culture of clericalism remains obviously perplexing, because it's by virtue of being a member of it, no matter how much I might resist it, I no doubt am complicit. And so how we stretch ourselves to that level of self-critique when it is in a way that will be constructive. So how can the church, how can this sort of, I'm sort of taking us a little bit off the main topic, but it is the topic in a sense. How can something like a common ground conversation help us, help the church? Let me rephrase it. What would be the outlines of a common ground type of conversation to address the hegemony of clericalism? What would have to happen to have that, so that you didn't end up, because the very nature of a common ground conversation would be you don't put the cleric in the room and beat him up. And you put a bunch of bishops in the room and tell them how bad they are. So we have the givenness that we have the Episcopal order, we have the Presbyteral order. How do we have conversations that help us out of this reality of that the Holy Father's explicitly names of clericalism we've got to undo? Nichole.
So on one hand, I think that common ground projects are falling on hard times in our culture, that there's a sense that speaking with someone who's a part of the enemy is in itself an act of complicity, it's an act of capitulation. And I think that as those who are working in a common ground framework, it's important to be aware of that kind of critique that our projects have been subject to as of late. But I think, while I obviously would not embrace that critique entirely as someone who believes in the integrity of this kind of project, I've thought about the role that the language of reconciliation should play in this, not just in the meeting convening this week, but in how the results are and the outcomes are received within dioceses and within parishes and religious orders and the like, that I think the temptation will be to really say, and now it's time to reconcile. And I think that it's key in this case for there to be contrition and that the reconciliatory work awaits actually moments just like you had, Father Place, to say, I've been a part of this, whether wittingly or unwittingly, whether I knew I was or not, to confess that to the church. And of course, there might not be the theological or doctrinal structures available to some members of the clergy to even think it possible or appropriate to confess to me as a laywoman, as a child who was put at risk for my entire life in this church. But I think that there will be a temptation to rush to that language. At the same time, I think that to get rid of that language, or to say, well, it's not cool with the culture right now, so we can't talk about reconciliation. Is there a way we could talk about the hope for it and keep that hope in view and keep it on the horizon without it being kind of a, it's home plate. We're just trying to cross home plate. If we stop thinking about it in terms of scoring and in terms of winning, is there a possibility there?
Carmen.
Yeah. I went to high school with kids who called McCarrick uncle. So I find it sort of difficult, as well as Nichole does, to move to any kind of language of reconciliation or healing when the powers that have been, both ecclesial as well as those in various times of, law enforcement sometimes knew, because the church's relationship and how it played Catholics in other fields knew stuff and covered it up. So there are other complicities have not even really come out in terms of the stories and the manipulations and the activities that harmed everyone, including those who went on to be the very fine priests in the Archdiocese of New York, who in many ways I owe my vocation as a theologian to. And they too were victimized by these kinds of procedures that really had no business being part of what our communion of faith is called to. So I'm, as a Catholic, nowhere near reconciliation or healing language. At the same time, as a Catholic, recognizing that those who are in the priesthood too have suffered for the behaviors of others, and at some level sharing a different level of complicity, only because of how clericalism at one level has played itself out. And then theologically, I mean, and I don't want to sound like a heretic because I'm not, but how do we even begin to question what does ontological change mean? And I have to tell you that there's a part of me right now that's looking back at Augustine in his fight with the Donatists and going, maybe the Donatists had something there, questioning the spiritual authority of the clergy and the episcopacy when it was behaving in sinful manners that undermined their spiritual authority. And I don't think we're anywhere close yet, Michael, to having those conversations together. And I think in some ways the fact that we are lay folk and clergy, that we come from different positions and traditions in the church, and the four of us are even having this conversation with those who gather for the webinar, I think are the kinds of conversations that are necessary. The second piece is ritual. I'm sorry, but the sacramental system of the church has been used and abused to sustain some of this. So the default response to healing should probably not be the sacrament of confession. It probably should not be the Mass. And at some level, how do we decenter that? There was an interesting line Pope had, it was sometime in the past year, when he told people that perhaps they should do the rosary. And folks kind of like dismissed it as a pietistic response. And I was like, that's not a pietistic response, because who says the rosary? Who leads the rosaries? Even when you go to a parish, who are the leaders of the praying of the rosary? Your grandmother, there are women in the church, there's lay people, it's children, it's the sick, it's the poor, it's the hungry. You don't have to be ordained to lead the rosary. So I mean, even ritually, the response to this scandal crisis of leadership and abuse, how are we even ritually thinking that we need to decenter the clergy, because to decenter their leadership, they cannot be at the same time the instrument of healing. But kind of how are we all together in this mess. And I don't know that that part has been achieved yet, that we understand each other as being in it all together. So those are just some initial thoughts.
Well, that certainly has taken us, I didn't expect to talk about the Donatists today, but they're one of my favorites. Richard, some thoughts, and then we're going to move to some of the questions we've received.
Yeah. Well, mostly I just want to riff on some things that were said earlier. I was very much struck by what Nichole said earlier about just the need for repentance and symbolic acts of repentance. So, you know, I've been thinking about, because of a book I'm reading recently, the Liturgy of Pardon that Pope John Paul II presided over in 2000. It was one event, but it was actually a fairly profound liturgical event. And, you know, there could be worse uses of the bishop's time at this meeting if there were a well thought out, ritually significant expression of repentance on the part of leadership of the Universal Church. That actually would not be such a bad thing to see come out of this particular meeting. And I agree with Carmen. I suspect Carmen and I wouldn't disagree so much. You know, I suppose everything depends on how we use reconciliation language. If we use it as a way of a quick, make it better, say you're sorry and let's move on, then certainly I don't think we can do that. But I think of reconciliation as a far more time-intensive, robust, multi-staged process in which symbolic and liturgical expressions of repentance have a role to play. And so I would like to encourage that. I also agree with you, Father Michael, that look, I don't think addressing the clerical culture is about beating up on individual clergy. As Carmen pointed out, many of us know and continue to have strong allegiances to and friendships with clerics who played an important role in our lives. So the question is a reform of how we as a church understand the various kinds of ministry in the church, both ordained and non-ordained. Carmen mentioned, you know, the language of ontological change. I want to dive down that rabbit hole. I do want to say there's certainly room for a more helpful consideration of how we think about the theology of holy orders, how we think in less privatistic and quasi-magical ways about what holy orders accomplishes, without having to deny that there is an ancient tradition of the order of presbyter, the order of bishop, the order of deacon in the church. Though there is also the order of all the baptized. So I think it's actually a great common ground project to gather people from different perspectives together and say, let's talk about how we can affirm the need for different ministries of the church, including ordained ministries of leadership, while expunging the sin of clericalism at the same time. That strikes me as a very worthwhile project for the Catholic Common Ground Initiative.
We've received a couple questions. The first look at is, why have the expectations for this meeting in Rome been downplayed, do you think?
Well, I think that's strategically prudent, but perhaps also honest. I think earlier, was it Rick or Carmen who was commenting on the way that other countries beyond the United States, the process is in a different place than where we are in the United States, and that's part of what needs to happen is a raising of awareness. And perhaps some of these suggestions, I hope somebody's, tweeting this at Pontifex, oh, maybe a liturgy of pardon, maybe a way of expressing this ritually. But that trying to use the gathering as a place to begin to ask new questions, I think is smart. I think that that there will, and maybe even our larger societies, even globally today, there's a temptation to want to be efficient and do as much as possible and kind of ameliorate everything at once. But to Rick's point about reconciliation as a process, I think that that this is one stage. The late Mujerista theologian and ethicist Ana Maria Sazi Diaz talked about reconciliation as a process. And while it's easy to think of reconciliation in a linear fashion, she wanted to talk about the way that we enter reconciliation where we can, when we can, and that there need not be a set place for that. So I pray that that spirit is with the summit this week, that it's a starting point, and perhaps it would be wrong if they left and they had solved everything. So
I think another issue which I think the Holy Father experiences is that the way he's gathering, there's a second narrative, which is an ecclesiological one, that the way they are being gathered, he wants to be modeling his theology of synodality. Mm-hmm. And that there's not a president, but there's conveners / facilitators, and that there will be structured dialogue, structured prayer, is a whole different way of entering into it that doesn't invite snappy headline outcomes. I commented once in a presentation that wouldn't it be great if, when the Synod of Bishops gathers, that the headline out of the day would be, "There's no news today, the bishops are praying." And that is not something that is easily captured in our instantaneous culture as a sign of success. But in many ways, what we're about building common ground, there is no, the foundation of common ground is prayer, mm-hmm. and engagement of the Spirit. Mm-hmm. So that does, my imagination is that if that's what he is hoping for, then that's one of the reasons he was, quote, downplaying expectations. We had another question. As a young person in the church, what message can you give to young people to encourage them to not lose faith or credibility in the church? Now that's an
Nicole's the young
throw
person.
that out in the middle.
I don't feel so young these days with my infant keeping me up all night. But I think that all of us who are young at heart can speak to that as well. But for me, it's been a daily process. Actually, I happen to be married to a Protestant, and in conversation with members of his church who are very much praying for us as a Catholic communion, there's just been a constant reminder to focus on Jesus, to return, and the way I've interpreted that, in my Catholic idiom, of course, and practice and faith, has been return to the Eucharist, but also the life of prayer, to the previous point, that's taking it day at a time has been my response, just trying to hold in tension that which is awful and is in need of lament, honestly, and that which is grounding and worthy of celebration. And I think it's easy right now for all of us, not just the young, to feel unmoored. But I think that some of that is in our anchor is in the practice of prayer, on returning to and constantly revisiting the reasons that we are Catholic in the first place. I've in my practice of participation in the Mass, I've really focused my visual attention and attentiveness to the cross and to the crucifix, and just as a reminder of who God is and how God loves, and just to hold on to that for right now.
Thank you. Carmen?
Yeah, I would say two things. The first is that we are the church, together the church, and that we be careful not to conflate hierarchy with church as equivalents. Our bishops are part of the church, but we are the church. The church is bigger than our hierarchies. The second thing is that the church makes a preferential option for the young. And that comes out at the exact same time and in the same documents that the preferential option for the poor come out. But it's the forgotten option, but it's still there. And at some point, how do we as church continue to remind ourselves that that's an option that needs to be is an imperative as much as the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable is. And so that is part of our heritage, and that the young have a right to hold us to that, and to understand also that they participate as well in the making of what this community will be and should be now.
Richard.
Well, I don't know that I have any great insight to speak about the perspective of the young, but I want to follow on what Carmen said. First of all, the statement we all could agree to, which is, of course, that the church is not to be equated with the hierarchy, but the whole church. And this is one of the things that Pope Francis is doing. You know, the Second Vatican Council emphasized collegiality, and it was an important contribution. But properly speaking, at Vatican II, collegiality referred to the bishops, right? And that's the danger of our focusing too much on, for example, episcopal synods or this meeting of presidents. It's one of the reasons why I put forward Australia's example of a plenary council, because that speaks to what Pope Francis has called us to. Synodality is more than bishops talking to one another. Synodality is cultivating habits of becoming a listening and accompanying church. And so one of the things that I hope will come out of this is an imperative to the bishops to create more structures that are not episcopocentric, but are in fact inviting and creating spaces that allow the whole people to speak. I'm thinking of the way in which our bishops, as you well know, Michael, in the 1980s, when we were looking at the two U.S. bishops pastorals in the 80s, employed a methodology at the local church where there were public spaces in which the bishop sat simply to listen and didn't speak, and created spaces for the people themselves to speak. We're going to need to do much more institutionally to create those kinds of spaces to allow the victims, and not just the victims, but the ordinary faithful people that Nichole was invoking, the folks who keep getting up and going to Sunday, going to Mass each Sunday, even as they just feel beleaguered by all of this, to give them a space to articulate why this is in fact their church and why it matters so much to them.
Amen.
Well, I think with that, we will draw this conversation to a close. I thank our panelists for participating. I refer those who signed on to our Catholic Common Ground website. If you want to learn more about the initiative, there are resources to facilitate parish dialogue and other opportunities for dialogue, as well as the videos of some of the more recent lectures, and as well as the texts of the lectures going back to the very first years. So I thank you again and wish you all a great day. Take care now.